Welcome to our CIBSE event this evening. My name is Carla Bartholomew. I'm Vice Chair for the Regional Committee. I've just got a few housekeeping to do before we start the presentation. Can I just make a couple of points? So everyone should enter and leave the building through the glass doors at the front. And if you want to go to the toilet at any point, these two doors here are need an access code. So I think if we can pop it. Okay, so the door's been put. Natalie's put the door on the latch. That's fine. Toilets. There's two toilets located at ground floor. Please switch off your mobile phones. Fire. There's no planned fire alarm this evening. So if there is a fire, please leave the building via the nearest exits. There's one at the back there, or these two here. And we will assemble over the road on the other side of the road if you need to. And we've got a list of everyone, so we'll be checking. Can you please stick around so we can check that you're not stuck in the building or what have you, and we can tick your name off. And Arup has a no smoking policy. Oh, that's so nice there. Yeah, thank you. So I will now introduce Ant Wilson, who is our speaker this evening. He's Director of Sustainability and Advanced Design at ACOM. He's also a Fellow of CIBSE, a member of the Energy Institute, SLL, and Society for Facade Engineering. And his presentation this evening is going to be presented in Plymouth tomorrow as well. So if you have any sort of like offices in the Plymouth or Exeter or sort of like Cornwall region, then please let them know that that's going on. And this evening's lecture is covering the so-called performance gap, which you obviously already know. I would just like plug something quickly beforehand, if I'll get it in there at the beginning, that we've got our annual Christmas social, CIBSE social, on Thursday evening next week. We've got 2 sponsored tables at the Hype Fairy Tale in New York event, which is over at, I think it's at the Passenger Shed. So that's the tickets cost £10, but that's a 3-course meal. You want to have some wine on the table. It's going to look to be a really good evening. We hope to get lots of different CIBSE members there to join us. So please, if you'd like to come, please sign up through our website, through the CIBSE website on the Southwest Events page, and pass it on to your colleagues as well. So anyone who's not got the email, we'd love to have everyone come along. So I'll just pass you on to Anne now. Round of applause, please.
Can I thank you for giving up your time in attending this evening. I ought to say that probably some of the things I'll say you will disagree with, so I'm not here to try and please you with what I say makes you feel good. I'm trying to reflect on what I think I've learned over 42 years actually in building services engineering, and I sometimes get a bit annoyed when people keep on about a performance gap and thinking, well, why do we actually expect a building to perform as we said it would do when we've got no control often over how it is going to be used? So I've put together, it will often, I think, be a bit rambly, but I don't mean it to be. I think it just might be. And I wanted to throw in a few other ideas of things that you'll probably think are a bit controversial. But certainly performance seems to be the hot topic. If any of you've looked at this month's CIBSE Journal, all those bits are out of the CIBSE Journal to do with headline performance, or HVAC Systems Group has performance gap in its site, or stuff to do with performance awards. They've also got things in talking about display energy certificates and how they're not being used, and looking at compliance within the journal. And also the CPD at the back is on something called co-heating tests. And I've got a few results from co-heating tests of people saying, well, we've done a different type of test on a building, and it might get closer to performing, but it still doesn't give you exactly the same performance. So what is going wrong with what we're doing? And a lot of the grounds for the performance gap were people comparing often a display energy certificate, a DEC, with an energy performance certificate. One that said it would perform like X, but it didn't really mean it would perform like that. That was the way of doing it. And then they'd measure it and say, boy, we've got something that uses twice as much as they said it would. Well, did they say it would, or is that just problems in software, or problems with the users of the software, or problems with our knowledge of physics, where are the shortfalls, and how do all those things add up to some buildings using 3 or 4 times the energy that they thought they would? And is there anything wrong in that? And you'll probably all have your own opinions on it, but I know from my own, I'll say my own mistakes, but just a simple budgeting I did as being now a dad of 3 kids that are married and essentially got 3 grandkids, that I thought I'd budget, and just saying this at the start, I'd budget from going from my wife and I working, both out of work, to my wife giving up work to look after our first child. And I thought, it's all right, I can cover the gas bill and the electric bill and the phone bill and all these bits. I've got it all sorted. I can do it. What I didn't budget on is actually when someone's at home all the time and you've got a new baby in the house and the house is a bit warmer, your gas bill can quadruple. It's the same house, and the electric bill goes up. And the thing that annoyed me most probably was the phone bill went up about a factor of 10, because no one uses the phone. But if you're in the home on your own, you've got kids and you want to get a break, you phone someone up. So how do we actually deal with people in buildings? So a lot of the discussion was on these things of a display energy certificate and an energy performance certificate. And I've got to confess, I worked with the government on doing some of this stuff. Doesn't mean to say you actually agree with it, and I'm not allowed to criticise what the government do, but essentially an energy performance certificate is a lie, and the display energy certificate is a bigger lie. And why is it a lie, and why is there a performance gap? Because they're looking at this and then saying, well, we said it was going to be an A+ building or an A building, and when we come and measure it, it's an E or F building. Okay? So there's a gap. So what's causing that difference? Now, what you've got to look at is what is the unit of that scale? Anyone know the units of these scales? Pardon? No. It's very confusing, because if I looked at a SAP rating, a high number is good, and on this one a high number is bad, which is confusing for some people considering they're both looking at it. But it talks there about that being more energy efficient and that less energy efficient. So you'd think it was in an energy unit. Why isn't it in kilowatt hours or gigajoules per 100 cubic meters or some energy unit? Well, actually, it's dimensionless. Those numbers mean nothing really, except they're dividing 2 things to give you a ratio, and A is supposed to be better than G. But it may not be in energy terms. And people would look at it and think, well, if that says it's more energy efficient, and I've got an A-rated building ought to use less energy than a D or an E-rated building. Why? It's the assumption that should be made if it says that, but it's not true, and that doesn't actually say that. But the text on it, you could say, is what is not right. Tunde? So I want to look at something that came out of that, and this is probably even worse, and I think I should have done something a bit better with it. But the question was, which is more efficient, the B-rated building at 46 or the E-rated building at 109? And as you might expect, it was the E-rated building was better than the B-rated building in terms of energy performance. It was reported also in the Royal Academy Engineers thing. It was done by the Better Buildings Partnership, and they looked at A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and so those are the categories that you get on your energy performance certificate. And this is the actual energy use, which is in an energy unit. It's in kilowatt hours per square metre. So it's not a good sample size to say that actually E's are better than an A, but actually the average of E is better than the A-rated building. And quite a few of the E-rated buildings were pretty good, and the D-rated buildings were good. But you'd think there ought to be some correlation between kilowatt hours per square metre and what the rating was that you calculated as an energy performance rating. So you're all clever people. What do you think is the major reason for that difference? Okay. Pardon? CO2. It is CO2, because it's a measure of CO2 and ratios of CO2. So you can get a really good A rating because you can get low CO2. And how to do it? You put in a biomass CHP scheme, which uses a lot more energy than actually having a gas boiler in there in terms of carbon, but it's seen as good because it hasn't got the CO2 associated with it. So it's a CO2 ratio, which is not an energy unit. So when you start comparing a kilowatt hour against an arbitrary number, because it is sort of arbitrary, because even within the same sort of thing, I'll tell you what it's like. It's like saying, I'm going to look at all the cars on the road, and I'll get the cars in a minute, and say, we'll only compare a Mini with a Mini, and we'll only compare a Ferrari with a Ferrari, and we'll only compare a Land Rover with a Land Rover. And we'll have more efficient Land Rovers, but you normalise it by like the average of Land Rovers. So you look at a Land Rover, and you compare the diesel one with the petrol one, and then the 4x4 permanent, whatever it is, and you say, well, that one's better than that one. That's an A Land Rover, that's a B Land Rover, that's a C Land Rover. And that's what you do with buildings. You don't take any notice, really, of the shape, size, form of it, because you actually divide the numbers out by the area of the building. And you do it in one, and do it in the other, you compare the two, and you divide. Now, the reason that is there is to make it acceptable as a change in the mechanism of building regs. They wanted to go over to calculate it, and if you go from a thing where everyone used a book and said, oh, we use 0.6 U value, or 0.45, or 0.3, to something that isn't based upon a U value, you want something that says, well, actually, we've got no control over what size of building we might put on that city centre site or on that funny shaped bit of land. So we've got to allow it to say, well, if you did it to standard A, which is acceptable, and then we do standard B, we'll divide the two out and we get a ratio. People understand that? But that's how it's done. So what also happens is if you look at calculating using the two mechanisms of an asset rating or an operation rating, you could say that for the same building in each type of mechanism, hotels, deep plan, shallow plan, that the asset rating is usually lower than the operational rating, except when you come to supermarkets. So why are supermarkets different? Or why are there big differences in different types of buildings? Now, the problem is with this work is the government only has a certain amount of money. And when they want to change the regulations, they can't look at 50,000 different types of buildings. They've got to say, we'll look at a few sample types of buildings. And our regs are based upon, you might say, flimsy evidence. I shouldn't really say that, because we've done most of the work behind that flimsy evidence. But when you do it, you realise, well, hold on, by changing this little thing, it can make a big difference. But we're not looking at those scenarios, and where are we actually modelling it? Is the building going to be down on the top of Dartmoor, or is it going to be over in East Anglia? Or where is it in the UK? Where do we model it for? Because we're not going to model it for every location that we've got. Now, I want you to contrast that with some real data. Now, we always say it's real, but take this as it is sort of real, but it may not be. But if you've done a building and you've done identical units, and this was presented actually by the president of ASHRAE at the moment, who's a professor over, I think it's in Denmark. And I asked him for the slide because I've seen it on many things, but this is such a graphic illustration, a fairly well researched and rigorous analysis. So they've looked at it for 4 years, the red, the blue, the green, and the cross. And they've taken these 290 identical units and said, well, how much energy are they using per square metre? So the heating use in kilowatt hours per square metre, and up the side is the number out of that 290 that are in each of the sort of categories. How many use 100, how many use 75, 60, etc. So you've got some trends in green, and you've got the same sort of trends in crosses and in blue. So you've got them around the 100 mark. But some of them are up to 200, and some of them down as low as 20. So you could say that when we give a certificate, we really ought to say, well, you can expect it to be 100, but it could be as high as 200, or it could be as little as 20. You think, well, that's pretty wide, isn't it? So what has made that difference? That difference is primarily people. Something you haven't got any control over, and I haven't got any control over. That is the prime reason. Because they can be tested, they can be commissioned. That was a pretty good sample. Now, I used to think it was 5 to 1, then I thought it was 10 to 1, 20 to 1 is some things. But I looked at a study that was done in Cornwall on similar houses, and they had a 65 to 1 difference between the best performing home of that type to the least performing home of that type. So how can that be? How can it be? Well, I can tell you that the lowest one, no one's in it, other than about a week, 2 weeks a year, because it's a holiday home and it's shut up without a lot of energy use. And the other one might have 4-bedroom with teenage, I shouldn't say that, being sexist, people that use a lot of showers and have showers in the morning and the evening and change their clothes 4 times a day, and they're using a lot of energy. And if you start looking at the energy use in your energy bills, it depends on who's in it and what lifestyle they live. So that says we've got a problem. Even if we know what it is, you can just look at a sample. Now, in one sense, we could probably do that if we got hold of the data for every terrace that there might be in Manchester or Newcastle or the big cities, where you've got all these back-to-backs and a whole row, and for all intents and purposes, eliminate the M1s as end effects, you could say there's 25 in there. What's the difference between 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Now, I know somebody did a PhD at Loughborough, and they did precisely that with 5 units. And the 5 unit showed this difference, okay? The worst performing used, I think it was a fifth of, right, 5 times more than the best performing. So they went in to analyse it. And they went into the rooms, and they put sensors on all the windows and measured the temperatures in the space. They didn't measure all the loads that were being used, but they said, well, what's the guy heating it to? Does he open the windows? Does he not open the windows? And the long and short of it is, the guy who used least, a fifth of the worst, what did he do? He heated it to 19, and he never opened his windows once. Fact, that's what he did. The guy who used most always had his window open. He slept with it, he wouldn't sleep without his window open, and he wanted to heat his room to 24. So you could say, well, I could do the sums now. If I know I'm heating it to 24 and not 20, or at 19 instead of 20, and we've got all this rule of thumb that says for every degree it's probably 10%, how do you know what a room's heated to? And how do you know whether they're opening windows and doors? Because we don't actually model our buildings to have the front and back door open at the same time. And even if you've got a passive house, which is well seed and tested, if the front door is open and the back door is open, you've got 2 days' worth of air change going through in 20 minutes. If you take the low values that come out of a passive house. So you've got to be very careful. Now, I didn't get the pictures I wanted. I wanted 2 pictures to illustrate something, and I failed really with them. So I put, now, I don't know if you can, that one there says 21.9 degrees C and 35% RH. And that one there says 20.8 degrees and 35% RH. That's the, about that high metal filing cabinet in my workplace, and they say different things, and they're from the same place. Now, that is sort of okay. I think the tolerance on that is pretty acceptable, and not that different. But what my wife gets upset about is the biggest meter I've got is a smart meter. Now, I'm on my 3rd smart meter, and I've got a smart meter which is directly below my Honeywell stat that controls the heating. And on top of that, I sit one of these, which is one of these numbers here, and then I've got one in the corners of the room where that is. So I then say, my wife says, I'm really cold. And I said, well, it's actually set to 18.5. I'll up it to 20. But hold on, that says it's 18.5. But my smart meter directly below, which has got a thermostat in it, says it's 15. Now, I know the outside, because I've got an actual outside weather station. It's 2.7 outside. So I then start measuring it with different ones of these dotted around the house. So essentially, you're in an open plan area. That, you know, the doors aren't shut or anything. It's all open. Now, so one of the rooms is 15.6 is 48, 16.1 is 49. So I reckon they're pretty close. You know, I wouldn't worry about that. That there, you think, well, hold on, we're up to 2 points in different degrees. But the one that's worrying, they're next door to each other, one above the other, and it's not as if one's up there and one's down here. That's on this shelf here with a phone on it, and the other one's on the wall just there. And that is exactly above the other one. So why are they all giving different answers? So the other thing we do, we say, we know what it is because we've measured it. Well, what have you actually measured? Is the measurements we make any use? Are they right? Are they accurate? How well calibrated is the stuff where we're doing the measurements? If we had 3 people measuring it, and we say we might have 3 people modelling it, and they all give you different answers, if you have 3 people measuring it, they'd all get different answers. So we're comparing stuff that's really quite woolly out there in practice. That's just another issue of why you may not get what you say. It's actually quite clear on my screen here. I can see 21.9, 20.8 quite clearly. Sorry about that. Now, these are some other tests from Leeds Beckett. Now, Leeds Beckett have done a lot of work with, I mentioned earlier, about co-heating tests. And some people are getting quite excited about co-heating tests. Are people here familiar with a co-heating test? Anyone at all? Okay. Well, what they say is we're looking at conditions. So we heat it up to an actual temperature in a space, and we look at how much heat's going in to get the energy balance, and we'll tell you actually what the U values are and what the energy consumption is. Now, I have some doubts about whether we should be using it, because you're creating artificial conditions in the space. Now, you have electric blowers. You're actually changing the way that a U value will work on a wall or surfaces. So you haven't actually got actual conditions in a space. But if you start looking at it and saying, well, we measured the heat loss and we predicted it, you'll see quite nicely there are a lot of differences. And there's a lot more that they've done. Different types of houses, they've measured it, and they get big differences. Now, that is a pretty annoying difference, isn't it? You said it's going to be one thing, it's another thing. The thing that does come out of it is these ones up here that are closer, the closer ones, in reality, are passive house design things. They've had a lot more care taken over actually putting the things together. But they still give you differences. And the sort of difference you'll get, these are all passive house ones, courtesy of Leeds Beckett. I've got a friend who lives in this group of houses, and he could tell you that I think that the houses on there, they've got a difference between what one uses and another uses. They all use different amounts. But they're not going to give you the same. And where are the differences coming from? Well, it could be the modeler was no good. It could be the software is no good. It could be the weather data we're using is useless and we're not ever modelling it against real data. If we're trying to predict what's going to happen, we haven't got the weather data for that date at hand. Now, this was something that caused a big stir. It came out of work at Exeter University, but the guy is now at University of Bath. And it got picked up by the Telegraph, and I think it might have got picked up by the Guardian. And he essentially said modelers are incompetent, paraphrasing it, because they don't know what they're doing. You could get better answers by picking someone off the street, and they'll give you a better sense than you're getting out of these experienced modelers. And the thing that got my goat a bit is I've been doing modelling, this sort of stuff, for, certainly actively for 38 years. And essentially, the older you get, and I'm in the older category, the least likely you were to get it right. That's exactly what it said. And it said there, the research found that very modelling professionals could not agree on which aspects were important and which were not important and all the rest of it. Now, to me, the research that went behind that is not that good. That's my opinion, because they've done a model in a bit of software and they've assumed that the results from the model represent exactly what happens in practice. Well, that's a fundamental flaw to do that in the first place, because the models aren't that good. Are the people any good? Well, they're following rules that they've got to follow because they're doing it often for compliance and they're not doing it to predict an energy load. And then we had some nice feedback to them saying we take great issues with the blanket criticism out to modellers in the study, and it said why they thought that it was not necessarily that good bit of research that had made the headline. But it's certainly focused on, actually, perhaps it's not just the way it's built and the contractors and a soft landings approach or certain things we want to do. What about the models and the modellers? Now, how many people in the room are modellers? Not a few. Now, it hurts a bit when you're told you're incompetent, doesn't it? You know, that you're just not up to the task. And perhaps I ought to hang up my boots because I'm on the older end and I'm more likely to get it wrong than you are. But it comes down to really what is performance. What do we mean by performance in a building? Now, I thought I'd go in and look at cars, because a lot of people can understand cars, and I got accused yesterday when I put this together by someone in our group, came up to me and said, well, are you looking for a new car then, Ant? I said, hardly. Well, why have you got all those up? I said, well, I was thinking about something to illustrate what I mean. So I just Googled best performance cars. That was what I put in, because I'm talking about performance and performance gap. And they came up as the top 10 best performing cars. But what's that based on? Then none of them are fuel efficient. That's what I really wanted, how good they are in terms of giving me economy. Their metric was a combination of speed and acceleration. I was interested in speed of a car and acceleration of a car. You want to be worried about your MPG, don't you, or your CO2 emissions. But anyway, that's what you get if you start looking at performance. So I then looked at electric cars, because I'm on my third Prius, and I like a Prius, and it's pretty economical, I think. It doesn't do 0 to 60 in any sensational time, or it doesn't. But then these are the top 2 out of a survey for best electric car. And I thought it's interesting what they said about it. So here is the Model S P100D. The 100 means it's got a 100 kilowatt hour capacity battery in it. And it says, look, this high performance model can do 0 to 60 in as little as 2.5 seconds. Now, I also found a report that tested it against Ferraris and Porsches and other things, and it beat all of them, and they got the time down to 2.2 seconds for a real car on a drag track. So that's not over-egging it, saying it can do 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds. And, believe it or not, it does that with zero emissions out the exhaust. So to me, that's a good car. You start looking at this little thing, the Zoe, and it's not about speed, and it's not about, but it's good because it's got a maximum range of 250 miles. And then a little caveat, but admits that 174 miles is more realistic in the summer, and in the winter it might be half of that, drop to below 112. And if you want to heat it while you're driving, it might drop down to 90. Now, if you bought it thinking this car is going to do 250 miles, to me that's a bit more important than saying, well, I bought a house and it's going to cost me £20 a week to run it, and it's actually costing me 40, because I could be stuck on the M25 or stuck on a motorway and it's run out of juice and I'm going nowhere. So what is the performance of that car, and what's the performance of that, and what are the metrics we're using to define the performance of the building? So you can think of, you look at it on a standard test. Does anyone know exactly what the tests are for testing a car? I'll tell you who does know. VW. Now, don't you think they were really smart? Weren't they great at getting a Bosch unit? It could predict what was happening and adapt its running conditions to knowing it was a test. Now, I think that is blooming brilliant. Is it ethical? Surely it's showing you can know that there's a difference and you can adjust the engine to know what the conditions are. You buy a car on a normal test procedure, they've sort of done that in a different way. And I'll tell you how they've done it, but they're not getting stick. VW got stick for doing something I thought was pretty intelligent. I've got to be careful, I'm losing people already. But right, this is the cycles, right, you go through. Urban, let me tell you exactly what we have to do. The engine's got to be run in. It's got to be at least 1,800 miles on it. It's not on a road, it's done on a rolling road. It's in an environment of 20 degrees C to 30 degrees C. Now, how many people in the room have got a car? You of you? Okay. What's the difference between your summer MPG and your winter MPG? Are they the same? If you had a diesel car, it's the same. Do you use the same fuel in winter or in summer? You think you do, but you don't. There's a difference in the fuel between winter and summer in the UK because of viscosity and not wanting to have heaters to heat up the oil to keep it flowing. So there's a difference in the fuel. It's not the same. Now, if you know what that cycle is, and you know precisely what it is for any car, you can tune your gear ratios, if you've got a manual or an automatic with more and more gears, to give you optimum performance to meet that curve and get it through to save you tax. And most people will do that because it makes sense. You don't want to say it's going to cost you, £200 a year to tax it when you could bring it down a band or two by actually playing games with the gear ratios in a car. But the tests we use, are they universally applicable? Now, I know that my summer to winter MPG changes by about 3 to 4 MPG, summer to winter. I've got a Prius, and I always get one with narrow tyres, because changing from wide tyres to narrow tyres can save me 4 or 5 MPG when driving it. Now, those things, when they're in a test, they don't even need to be polished and sparkling, because they're not going against any wind resistance. They're just on a rolling road, following a cycle. And if you know what the cycle is, you can detect the cycling and then say, well, we can optimize the performance. Now, shouldn't we start optimizing performance based upon what's actually happening? I think we should. So we've got to get cleverer and not just say they're crooks. Now, why do cars underperform, or do they? This is the most common thing you'll see in cars. We'll get back to building, so if you don't mind me doing this a bit, but an E-Class, Merc are pretty bad. They claim good stuff and they're pretty lousy, and BMW are pretty lousy. Ford and Vauxhall, look, they're pretty good. They're down here. These things here, you're saying it's going to give you, say, 75 mpg, and it ends up giving you under 50. Now, is that acceptable? Well, you don't know how anyone's going to drive a car or be in it, where they're going to have everyone in every seat, they're going to have stuff in the boot. Some people complain when they tow their caravan and they get less than half what it says. What would you expect towing a caravan? I lose about 3 mpg if I put my windscreen wipers on. If it's raining, I'll lose my mpg easily, because it's fairly aerodynamic. But the minute you have these windscreen wipers going up and down, you lose aerodynamic cars. They're no good in rain. But we don't understand all these things, but they all make a mix of what happens. So when you do your building and you're modelling it, all you thermal modellers, how do you take account of the rain when it rains on your glass? What happens when in a car it starts to rain? Do you ever see it steaming up? Do you see the glass getting really cold because you've got water on it? Do you see a change in the dynamics of that thing? And how quickly the air temperature outside can change when it rains? You can lose 5 or 6 degrees on a warm day when it rains, within 15 minutes of it starting to rain. And yet we don't use rain in our thermal models. It's a big thermal indicator. Why don't we use rain? Well, we use temperature. So are we selective in what we use? But you can see here that you've got different conditions. And then you've got a difference between company car drivers and private car drivers. It might be the way they drive, because they're not paying for the petrol, perhaps, as a company driver. Or it might be that the company drivers drive a lot further and they're more than just doing 2 miles each way, where the actual consumption of fuel in your car could be easily half of what it says on the label. Now, this is the latest report I've seen on cars. Do they over or underperform? Real life test, 2 days, taking all these cars and driving them from Oxford out to Lincolnshire, over to Worcestershire, a mix of motorways, hilly, city centres, stop-start. Real conditions on real roads over 2 days of testing. Right, the winner is the Ford Fiesta TDCI, and it got 122 mpg. Jazz, pretty good. It overperformed by 60%. It got 88.73 mpg, and the actual combined mpg was 55.4. Every single one of those cars, when tested in real life conditions, overperformed. Real data, real roads in the UK, driving from, what's the golf course in around Coventry and Birmingham? Yes, that area. And they went, they did a defined route for each of those cars, and they did pretty good. The electric ones did pretty good. They got better. Every single one overperformed. So do cars underperform, or do they overperform? It shows you the spread. If you can say that what car, I think on this one, would say they reckon that on average a typical car is 24.1% lower than the average that's given. And a lot of them are 40%. And you saw those ones at 50 and 40. But you can get certain people driving them on these challenges with real road testing, and they can overperform by 60%. So do they overperform by 60 or underperform by 40? That's quite a gap, isn't it? So you reckon you can predict how someone will drive a car? Well, we can. Can we predict how someone's going to use a building? That's assuming they're right in the first place and set up correctly. Now, I used to say probably 10, 15 years ago, when this stuff came out to go on a fridge and a freezer, is it will tell me I'm going to use a certain rating on a fridge, right? 150 kilowatt hours per year. And I'd be pretty confident if I've got an audience less than 50, which is here, that I could say to people, I'd give £100 to anyone who actually uses what it says on the label, because I don't believe any of you will do. I'll still be pretty confident in telling you that it might say you're going to use 150, but if we did a straw poll and I gave you all exactly the same fridge and came back a year later and said, how much did you use? Was it 150? Some of you are going to use 400 or 500, and some of you might use 50. I'm confident of that. I'm confident in offices, which use often the same fridge, that if my granny had one, she might open it 2 times in the morning and perhaps 3 times in the afternoon, and there wouldn't be an awful lot in it. She wouldn't be putting hot stuff in it. She wouldn't be doing things, and she'd have a pretty low number. If it's in our office, I bet those doors are open 30, 40 times an hour, and there's milk going in and out of it, and it's probably the door's open as much as it's shut, and you're trying to maintain it at 5 degrees, you're going to be using 600, 700 kilowatt hours. Does that make sense to you? Yet we put a label on it because it's actually a standard test condition, which means you can at least compare them. But you can't predict what it's going to use until you know who's using it. Right, so that's preamble. Probably spent too long doing that. So I'm going to get through to the points now that I wanted to cover. So we're all right till 9, wasn't it? 9? No, I'll try and speed up. I want to cover weather data and people and thermal properties of materials, and say, well, we think we know what's happening, but do we know how to operate buildings, and how accurate are models and metering? Because I think models need a lot of improvement. So what should we be doing? Well, let's look at climate. This is not local. I said about local, but just look at the rate of change on this chart. I don't know if you've ever seen it. I think it's a funky diagram, this. It's looking at Arctic ice between 1979 and 2017. Now, again, 20 years ago, I used to use Arctic ice as an indication of how fast the climate is changing. And I used to say that when I was born, 1957, to when I was talking then, we've lost more than half the Arctic ice that there is. Now, if you start looking at this now, from 1997, that's the overall volume, and you're looking at different months as we go around. Okay, so the different colours would be within that month going around. So these are the summer conditions, and these are the winter conditions, and the outside ones there are the times when it's essentially got most ice after the summer freeze, and then it's probably the black one is September is when you've got the least ice. Now, if you're looking at it, you've gone up there from 17.5 down to about 5, and you've gone from other points. Anyway, we're seeing a massive change in Arctic ice in volume. And what that means is there's less area, there's less ability to reflect the sun back out again. It's heating up the oceans, which accelerates, and it spirals into that sort of spiral. Now, that's looking at where we were in 2007 now, back to where we were is the average of the period, and then the earlier years up top. So you're seeing that changing from the least ice down in September to most ice there in the March, April. But that is changing very rapidly. That's not that big a period of time. What about global near-surface annual average temperatures? They're going up and up. Now we've had times when they've bottomed around a bit, but in essence, they'll still move around, but we're still getting gradually warmer and warmer. If you want to put a curve fit through it in that period, you can say, well, they're going up at a rate based upon the slope of that line that you put through it. Now, we do know also that it messes around, and 2010 was particularly cold, and certain summers were particularly warm, but we've got quite a change in the temperatures of how you deal with it. So I talked about 2010 being cold. Well, 2010 was particularly cold. It was about 5 degrees wherever you were in the UK, lower than normal for the whole of the month. We have places in the UK that actually never went above freezing for the whole of the month. Now, that's quite unusual. Now, I had a complaint from a building operator that I told him essentially what we thought the energy consumption was going to be, and he phoned me up and said, this is ridiculous, we've just got our energy bill in, and it's 3 times what we were expected. I said, well, what were you expecting? I was expecting what you said it might be, which was a number, and it was 3 times higher. And I said, I'm not surprised. And he looked at me and said, don't say that. I said, I'm not. How come you're not surprised? I said, well, it was below freezing all the time. Did you want your building to freeze and all the pipes burst and you have a massive bill for it actually flooding? Or do you want the thermostat to kick in as a frostat and say, even though I haven't got anyone in it all over Christmas, I think I ought to have the heating on to stop the pipes freezing? Why does it do that? I said, well, it's pretty good design, I think, to stop it flooding and freezing. And I said, if you start heating it when it's that cold outside and you've got it heating all the time to stop pipes freezing, it's going to use a lot of energy. You didn't tell me that. No, I didn't tell him it. So am I at fault for not explaining that temperatures can get pretty cold? It's probably better to have a frost set point to say we don't want the pipes freezing. But it makes a difference. So we're looking at changes, and the changes, I don't think because we lived through them, were as aware how quickly stuff is changing. To think of it as a degree or 2, you can look at the surface temperature, it's gone up by 1 degree over a long period of time. But the rate of change of our climate in the UK, to me, is phenomenal. Okay? And that's just looking at a model being based upon what might be on a weather tape, which is probably 20-year averages of 20 years ago, compared with predictive of what it might be moving forward. Now, these are things that I don't like using them because they're very crude, but it certainly gives you an indication of outside temperature. It's based upon the same baseline. Now, that baseline now shouldn't be 15.5. It should perhaps be 10 or 9, a much lower number, because we don't need to heat it at when outside's 15.5. But if you say this is identical numbers, the rolling 20-year average, okay, so it's not set points which are wiggly, you just every year you reset your 20-year rolling average. Does that make sense to people? Yeah. So the warmest place in the UK tends to be London, and the coldest place has changed over in Scotland from being North Scotland to East Scotland. I don't understand why, but it has. But all of them have seen a massive reduction. And I say massive because there it's anything between 13.7, I think, and 19.3. That the percentage reduction of heating demand, assuming that we still need to heat at the same rate, and we don't. So there'll be other savings that have come into our buildings. Now that stopped in 2006. But I thought I'd look up the latest numbers for regions. And this could be perceived as me trying to misguide you. I'm not. But the regions have changed, and that's why it's often difficult to do it. So even though we've got a southeast up there, and I've got a southeast and a southwest, and I've got Wales and other things, the regions are actually different, because you used to have southeast and southwest, and then they put in a southern England. So we've got different things in it. So I've taken what it uses here, but some of that is in a new category when I come here called south. But if you think that southwest is now down to 1693, down here somewhere, and you've got Wales at 199, you can do a direct comparison between Wales is the purple, because Wales hasn't changed much on that. So it was there at about 2,600, okay? See the purple line? And now, the average for Wales is 199, it's down there. Now, that is not just a figure or a rogue day or a month. That is aggregating across every month, looking at the temperatures outside and saying, how do you compare? Now, that means, clearly, we should be using a lot less heating in our buildings, because outside climate is now much, much warmer. Again, that makes sense to people, I hope. The one that's even more worrying is this thing. Cooling degree days. At what temperature do we need things cooled? Well, we never used to need cooling anywhere, really. So, yeah. But it's not a question of being 20, it's now up to about 30% when you take it up to 2017. It's got warm over that period from 61 up to 2019. You can look at 27, 28, 30% drop in heating demand. When you sort of say, well, it's gone from 20 up to over 50 by 2006, and now it's almost up at 100, you're talking about not just a percentage, you're talking about 500% or 350% more demand for cooling just based upon outside temperature. Okay? Outside temperature is that much warmer. And that's not taking the scenarios that say, well, the mean temperatures in winter are going to go up with this amount. Now, whether you believe these numbers or not, there's not one of them that's coming down in temperature, going through it, for the scenarios. So it's going to get warmer. And yet we're designing buildings still, or most people saying, oh, it's in the brief, we've got to design it to 28, 20, or we're designing it at a 31, 20, or we design it on some arbitrary number. CIBSE are not a lot of help, actually, and I'm a fan of CIBSE. They've given up telling you what to design to. They just say, look at the probability curves, and you make a pick out of a number, anything between 25 and 35. It's in that region. It just says, you know, we're not telling you what you use. And we want to be told, but they can't, because they don't really know where it's going. All they know is it's going to get a bit warmer. And that's based upon the modelling they've done, but it's also based upon looking at what's happened over the last 50 years. It's definitely got a lot warmer. And then what happens when we get in a town centre? The weather tapes up to recently, because they've now got different ones for different parts of London. We're never based there. They're always based back here. Then you have some London weather centres, and if you start looking at London weather centres, it's been at 3 different locations over the last 40 years. So there's no consistency between the data. But we've got weather data, but is it of any use to us? Most of the weather data we used has got some of it made up, and other ones will take you data that is from totally different places and mix it into one weather tape. Now, I don't knew that, but that's what they do. And when you start looking at radiation, when you're in Manchester weather tape, they always use the temperatures from airports for some reason. And then if you want the radiation, you go actually to what used to be Ministry of Agricultural, Fisheries and Fisheries Research site. So you'd say, well, I'm using Ringwave, but I'm actually taking the solar from something 60 miles away, because that's the closest place I can get to it. And you've got no match between what is happening with solar gain on space and the actual temperatures there, or what's happening with rain and the temperatures in the place, or what's happening with wind speed and the place. But what we are seeing is changes again, and we're seeing things getting warmer. And if you look at things which predict what you're using in PV, if any of you did stuff with PV, or if anyone uses SAP for doing a test for a house. So you're building your house down in Cornwall, say down at, I don't know, Truro or St Austell. What weather tape do you use when you're using SAP for Cornwall, down in, okay, do a site, there is one, Plymouth. Do you use Plymouth? Pardon? No, you don't, not for SAP. What do you use? The East Pennines. Yeah, it doesn't matter where you are in the UK, you have to do it if you can get standardisation for somewhere here. And it's going to be a lot warmer down there, it's going to be a lot colder up there, but you actually give you a certificate for a building that is not related to your site at all. And when you do the sums for people getting PV grants and that, it's based around 1,000, not that it can be over 1,200 there or 900 up here, you just do it for a site. Now, certainly with overheating now within SAP, you can take a location and use the data for looking at overheating, but for the SAP standard calc, use East Pennines, which we've got quite a variation. And you all know that, and I did this work a number of years ago now, 1989 probably, which was taking all the results from loads of schools and looking at how much energy is used in a school and comparing it where it is in terms of zones. So if it's a cold area, it's going to use more than if it's a warmer area. And you take all this data, and actually before you go and say what are the top 10 and the bottom 10, you'd get rid of all the outlying low ones, and you'd get rid of all the outlying high ones, assuming that the recording equipment is NAF. So when you've got something that's between there 70 and down to 25, there were definitely some in there that might have been up here and stupid numbers. So you get rid of them, and you get rid of some ridiculously low ones. Hopefully things are functioning. So that's not just saying that's every bit of data you measure, because data you measure can be really wrong. And I think that's known. If you looked at a heat meter is notoriously wrong at predicting or giving the wrong numbers coming out of a heat meter, mainly because people have installed them wrongly. Not that the function is there. It says you should have them this way up, and because it's against the ceiling, we haven't left them room. They do it upside down. Well, it doesn't measure right when it's upside down, and it's faulty, or it's too close to a bend, or it's in all the wrong places. So we can get things wrong, but that is often what people want. How much is it going to cost me per pupil to heat a classroom? Okay? So the average cost might be £33 or £37. Now that's quite a useful number for them, but they've also got to be aware that, hold on, it might be that's the average, but it could be down to there, or it could be up to here, so I want to factor something in. Now, one of the biggest determinants of how much it costs to heat a classroom is what? What do you think it is? How much does it cost to heat a classroom? That's pretty good. I like that one. Yes, I wasn't thinking of that, but energy price would be. Pardon? How you use it. How many pupils are there in a classroom? Say you're running a school and you've got 30 in your class. In 30 per class, you may not need to heat the classroom because there's enough heat coming off the people and what you're doing in it. Take that down to 20 people and you've got to start heating it. If you take it down to 15 people, you might triple the price per pupil to heat it, because you need to heat it a lot more, divide it out by fewer people. How many people are in the class determines how much it is per pupil. Pretty obvious. So what does it cost them? And they get hammered. Oh, you're using more energy. Yeah, I've got less people. We should be using less. Well, should you or shouldn't you? So some of the questions that Bath University or Exeter might have asked people, if I lower the air infiltration rate, do I get more or less efficient building? I'm lowering the infiltration rate, say from 7 to 5 to 3. Does it up the amount of energy or does it lower the amount of energy? Depends on the outside temperatures and what you're doing inside, but it can make a big difference. I'll show you some things in a minute. Sunlight, well, can we get lighting? And the other one I've put in there because we ignore it all the time, but it's quite important, is if you're down here where I'm going to be tomorrow, or you're here, you've got a lot more rain and a lot more moisture in your fabrics than you might do if you're over here where I live. And moisture has a big impact on how a building performs, yet it's never included. I don't know of any model that you're going to use of IES or TAS or SAP or SBEM. They don't use it. And it's an important quantity. And at least we're getting better with our guidance. So we've got the latest building performance modelling guide, which tells you how to do things, but it tells you how to do it to meet specific demands, and it tells you where you might do certain types of modelling at certain stages, and it says, are we looking at a benchmark, are we looking at degree days, pretty crude, are we using right up to dynamic thermal modelling, and dynamic thermal modelling is not very dynamic. Right? The only thing that's dynamic in most dynamic thermal models is the weather data. That's changing. But do you change your crackage? Do you change your U values? Do you change your occupancy? Well, have a profile that might be right. So I want us to look at some of the areas which are real weaknesses in the way that we model. Because I think the biggest problem is we believe as models we're doing it right. And I'm not saying you're doing it wrong, you're following the procedures you're told to, but we're not highlighting the weaknesses in a lot of the models. And I'm not doing this because I'm moaning at IES or I'm moaning it at EDSL or things like that. I wrote a lot of the software early on, and you get to know what is right and what is wrong. But I see loads of things where people love the answers that come out of these models and say, well, I've got a cooling load and I've got a heating load, and therefore my energy equals X. And you haven't got a clue what it is, you just know what your loads are. What system's using to deliver it, and then how are you controlling it? And you get all these bright sparks that annoy me. They say, well, it's ridiculous, you're heating and cooling in the same zone. Is that wrong to heat and cool in the same zone? I would. I don't want to be cold. I don't want to be sitting by a bit of glass, it's too cold. I want to be pretty comfortable. Now, you could say the fabrics are pretty poor and we've got a way of doing it, but we have all sorts of assumptions that go into models. So I'm going to go through some of it. It tells you what you need to take account of to look at it. So we've got to look at the characteristics of the building, we've got to look at all these things that are listed on here. But it doesn't tell you any amount of detail that we need to go in. So if I gave you all three models, an SBEM, an IES model, and a TAS model, they will all definitely give you a different answer. Some of them could make your building pass, and some will make it fail. That's definite, because they do it totally different ways. How can you expect something that uses totally different methodologies to give you the same answer? They can't. That's why they're different. One's using an ASHRAE essentially response method, which is TAS. One's using a more detailed method, which probably the most detailed method is ESP-R, but it's too complicated for most people to use. And then you're using SBEM, which is meant for people to get consistency of results, not give you the right answer. You want it to be simple. So what do we use? We've still got to include those, but it doesn't tell you how to actually include them. But we've got things that say we've got to look at, you know, being lean and clean and green and then offsetting the rest. That's the latest stuff out of the London plan from this month. And the thing that's gone down the list is they're almost sort of blacklisting CHP and district heating by the looks of it, because they don't think that's such a good idea anymore. But you'd need to read it and put your own interpretation on it. Now, I came across this because I was clearing out one of the cupboards at work. And this is the guy I worked with when I started at Oscar Faber in 1979. And he was a really bright guy. And at the time, I joined them because there were only three consultancies doing computer-aided design in any real depth. Arup, where we are today, Atkins, and Oscar Faber. And by far the best, I'm biased, was Oscar Faber. That's why I went there. And they had some of the best modelling tools available. And this was written, it was published in 74, but it was written after Peter had been down talking in Sydney. And I want you to think about this. The use of the CRT visual display unit in interactive design, right, with emphasis upon full coordination with the building structure, is probably the practice which shows most promise for the future. Now, I joined them in 79, and we had a model that had structures and services, costs and specs, all in the model. You wouldn't have written a spec in Oscar Faber in 81, 82, 83, 84. You hit a button and it comes out of the computer. No one wrote a spec. That stuff that we had in our computer became NES. If anyone used NES, that was the basis of NES. We had, before the company Facet, that some of you might remember, which stood for Faber Computing Engineering Technology, we had a bit of software called Facet, and that was Faber's cost estimating tool. And that was embedded, so it knew the number of bends and T's and pipes and ducts in the model. It was 3D clash detected back in the 70s, and it worked with the structures. I'm not lying, that existed. So where are we today? We're messing around with BIM, and we haven't got integrated specs, we haven't integrated costs. but you're trying to do the same thing that was done literally 40, 45 years ago. Peter was actually chair. Now look, it was set up in the 50s. In the mid-50s, they started using computers for building services design. It's not new, in the 50s, right? In 66, they set up a specialist building services group, and that was chaired by Peter Margit, in essence. So when I joined, we were working with the CICA, the Construction Industry Computer Association. They did models of daylighting and comparisons of daylight models from the 60s and 70s to see which were the best. Now, I put this one up because it's something that I'm very familiar with, that probably no one here will be. But this came out 10 years ago, looking back to the setup of the 30th anniversary of a bit of work that said, we've got to be careful with all these programs because they give us different answers. Okay? So what did they do? They came to Bristol. They came to Bristol. And there was an amazing building in Bristol called the SWEB. Have you still got SWEB, South West Electricity Board? Well, there used to be the South West Electricity Board. If you're in the main centre, they had a building there, but their thing at Avonbank was over towards Ashton Gate, I think, area. And they said, well, we use that because it's an amazing building because they don't need any heating in it. Now, they didn't need any heating because their lighting load on the floor was 58 watts a square metre, so they heated it with electric, but then they were the electricity board. But what they said was, we'll get these people to analyse it with different models. And these are the final reports that came out of the work. It was pretty rigorous. So there was the building. These were the sort of details that went into the models, and all the models were modelled blind. So you've got to come up and say what it's going to use for heating and cooling. And these are the different models. They don't tell you which one is which, but one of ours was in there called MPro. And they're the models. They're how they vary throughout the year and predicting it. And you compare each model with its essentially cooling load and heating load. Some are down here and some are up there. And there's a lot of difference, at least 2.5 to 1. So they're all predicting something that they think is the same building is going to operate in a different way or somehow, when they're all given an actual building to work on. Now, if you've got an actual building to work on, you're more likely to get it right than you guess what it's going to be at a design stage. I'm serious. If you know it and you can go in and measure it and look at it and you've got the data from the building, you're one step ahead of where we are in design when we've got a blank sheet of paper. And that gave you big variations. Now, what came out of this was this thing. And I was asked, I used to be very involved with something called the AIC and the IBC. And this year, they had their first conference back in the UK since, I think that's one was 16 or 19 years ago at Bath University. They held it in Nottingham. They said to me, will you come and do a keynote on what's happened in ventilation over the last 35 years? So I looked at that and thought the problem of realistic modelling of heat transport due to air movement through a building due to infiltration and convective coupling between zones. There's an issue. And I thought, what have we done to resolve any of that? We've still got a problem with infiltration and not knowing what it is, and we still don't know about convective coupling between zones, and we're not really modelling those things, we guess them. So what is the right values? Would we get any different answers if we did that same sort of blind test now? So I went on to spend about 4 years, 5 years doing a lot of work in air infiltration and a lot of work in lighting design and energy control of lighting. And this was a real moment for, I hadn't been in it long, this is 81 I think, and we were, and it came to mind because of the Grenfell Tower thing. We did some smoke movement programs and looking at fire spread in spaces on not on CFD, but using a multi-cell model. And everyone said, well, has it been validated? And we said, well, it looks like it's right, but we haven't got a fire to test it against. We had a big fire up at Withenshaw Hospital in Manchester. And I was sent, as quite a young lad, go up there and get all the information on this fire and see whether we could predict what actually happened. And I did. I predicted quite well what happened. But I learned something incredible through that experience. And I just want to say that is, why do we expect we can actually do it at the design stage? Now, I'll click on that slide. Okay? I knew where the fire was. I knew when it was in December. I knew the wind direction at that time. I knew that actually that all the fire drills were propped open with fire extinguishers, which they shouldn't have been. I know that it was December and it was 7 degrees, and with a northerly wind it shouldn't have been 7, it should have been a lot colder. I knew what the fire was. It was not a bed fire, and at that time everyone would simulate bed fires because that was the most common fire in a hospital. This was someone kicked their cigarette through the stairwell on a 3-story stair into a sheet store, caught fire to it, and all went up the thing and spread for over 200 metres in the building. They had real problems, but they had good traces of where all the smoke had gone. Now, 2 things really hit me. One is, at a design stage, I would have never predicted any of the key parameters. Wind speed, wind direction, date, fire, and all the things that go in to make it up. The one that really floored me was I've always modelled, assuming we've put in a window, we've put in a door, that's a windows the same as that one, that one, that one, that one. These doors are the same type, so we've got these doors probably in this building in different places. Now, if you start looking at the crackage around that door, in here it could scrape the carpet. On another one, it might be that far off the liner. It's the same door, but depending on where it is, and that's assuming they're shut, they could have a 10-to-1 difference in airflow across that door. I measured the crackage around all the windows, identical windows, and you had a spread like there was no tomorrow. And I thought, how would I have ever got that by just doing it? I would have said all the windows were the same. That's type A, B, and C, and they're slightly different. And the doors, they're all the same, if they look like that. But when you actually measure them, when they're installed, they're not at all what they say they are on the tin. And I would have never have predicted it. So I can come up and say, we validated the software, but only because we'd had a building that had almost burnt down, and I could see where it had gone. I could go back and do the analysis and find out all the unknowns, but I'd never have predicted any of those unknowns. Does that make sense? I better hurry up because I'm well over time. Sorry. Let's go on. So information within CIBSE tells you about windows. Windows are a real weak spot in every single bit of analysis you do. Because most people in this room do not understand how windows perform. I'm being arrogant there. I've spent a lot of time looking at it, but you probably don't understand how windows perform. We assume most of the models that you use for validation, all the dynamic models, that the temperature is bang in the middle of it and it's fully mixed. And that's a lie. They're not fully mixed. You assume that you're designing for people because you're trying to meet an operative temperature, and yet you're always controlling on air temperature. And that's why you often need perimeter heating and cooling in the same zone to make people comfortable. A lot of the research I did based upon that first work of 3 years research got translated into this one about the environmental toolkit for glazed facades. And I got paid to do a lot of interesting, I think, research. Now, in the old days, okay, we used to have, in a CIBSE guide, is the window sheltered, normal, or severe? And you'd look at it, and no one knew whether their site was sheltered, normal, or severe. You might say, well, I'm on the coast, it's going to be severe. I'm on here, it's sheltered. But which way is the wind blowing? Because the wind blowing really determines what the heat transfer coefficients are on that wall. So we don't dynamically change all the surface coefficients depending on the wind speed and what's happening on the surface. But now we do something even worse. We've got these standards up here called ISO standards. And everything we use is based upon an ISO standard way of measuring it. And I can tell you the ISO standard conditions never exist in the UK. They can't do because the solar radiation is too high. But it's an international standard. And before you had the international standard, you'd buy a bit of glass, and on the bit of glass it would tell you the British standard U value for this bit of glass is 1.8. The didnt standard is 2.1. The American standard in summer is 2.5. In winter is 2.8. They'd all be different. You'd have 9 different U values on the bit of glass. Now, which one was right? Do you realise how much the U value of glass changes on temperature difference across it? And they're all measured with the outside and the inside being exactly the same temperature. So what I put together is some things that we do in our models that we don't understand always. Now, if I've got a floor or a ceiling, have I got horizontal or have I got upward or downward flow? And when does it change during the day? So I dynamically change, knowing the temperature difference to each side to know which is forcing the movement across it. How dynamic is the U value? I can tell you it's very dynamic. And we have one U value and we use it, irrespective. Now, I wanted to do some of these things just to say that if you get glazing salesmen, they'll tell you the U values are all the same. And they're not. They're very dependent upon size, which is pretty obvious. This is a standard thing, 3 meters wide, different heights. These are the differences in the U value for a window, whether it's aluminium or UPVC, based upon the size of the window. So the bigger the window, the better it performs, usually. Most people don't actually know what the emissivity of the coating is. They just say it's low E. I've asked people what does low E mean. I've been told it's low energy. That's amazing, I didn't know that. Well, I've got it wrong, I always thought it was low emissivity. So if they do get it right, I said to people, what is a low emissivity glass? How low is low? So if you're specifying low emissivity, what emissivity are you specifying when you want your glass? How low do you want it? How low can you get? So emissivity, big difference. So uncoated, hard coat, soft coat. Soft coats are used better than hard coats. They go on different surfaces and better glass. Now this is the one I love to show people, because people I still see, and it was in a lot of software, particularly, I don't mean knocking it, but like SciMap and HeberComp, you'd get a database of glass. And if people put a window in, they'd put in glass. They don't put in windows, they put in glass, because it's an easy number to get hold of. Because every time you do a window and it's a different size, you need a different U value. And how many times have you put in 50, 60 different types of glass U value because the glass is different in each place that it might be in a building? But these are the centre panes, which are easy to make. This is just one manufacturer with one range. So they've got it with fixed lights and open lights. And then they've said these are the window sizes. So we'll do an S1, S2, S3, S4. They're not that vastly different. They're not saying I'm doing a little thing like that up to 3 metres wide by 3 metres high. But even within that range, people are saying, it's all right, we're in range. We've said we're going to have 1.5. But 1.5 on a lot of them is outside what you're allowed to use because it's about a window. So do we understand how windows perform? So you can get bits of kit that will tell you about calculating the U values. You can look at the effect of the thickness of the the cavity. Now it's pretty complex when you get into dealing with it properly, and most people don't. They just take a U value and hope it's going to work for them. They might put in the you might put the absorption transmission, light transmission free to pane, and it will work out certain things. But then you don't really know what the software is doing with it. And the scales that we use keep changing. British Fenestration Rating Council, that's the 2013 one, that's the 2016 one, that's the 2006 one. So we used to have A to G, then we had A star to G, then we've got A star to W, and we're changing what's happening with these things all the time. But is that a good indication using an energy rating? Because I can have a U value, and it could be an A rating, it could be a C rating, or a D rating. Because that scale is not based upon the U value. Well, the U value is part of it, but it also takes the solar gain into account, it also takes air infiltration into account. So it's more than just a U value, it needs to know how much solar is coming in. And the annoying thing is with that, it tells you get loads of useful solar gain, and you get a load of useful solar gain when you don't want it in the summer, and not a lot always when you want it in the winter. So that it overall has a balance, it might say, oh, it's a net zero energy window. Yeah, but I need a shift on it of about 6 months. Air infiltration and air permeability. I've used this before, so you may have seen it. But this is testing windows under infiltration and exfiltration. It's the same window. You're either blowing it from inside or you're blowing it from outside. Manufacturers are pretty clever because they know the test that for rain and ingress, you've got to make a gasket that seals under pressure so you don't get rain coming in. So when they do that and you test it the other way round, it actually pulls the gaskets apart and they leak like a sieve. Perhaps 10 to 1 difference in airflow between infiltration and exfiltration. Now, good tests will do it under both, but you never know when you're doing the model whether that surface is under suction or under pressure. Now, you might say, well, I know the wind speed and I might know the wind direction, but what about all the cases of what is under pressure? So if the wind's coming and hitting that surface, usually for every one surface that's under pressure, that are all under negative. So the load in your building is going to say, if it's blowing a gale, I've only got a gain or a loss in that space. It's been preconditioned there because that's what you need to do to stop that room getting hot or cold. And then what's coming into here doesn't have an air load at all. Now we've got lovely modelers who like to say, well, here's the air tightness test, we'll split it up and it goes equally in all the rooms. Well, what are you putting outside air into the middle of the building? Now, you wouldn't do that, would you? No one in this room would put outside air into the middle of the building. How did it get there? But we don't understand how convective coupling works. We don't understand how stratification works in space. We don't understand certainly how people are going to use it. Now, I just took this. This is at Queen Elizabeth building at UEA. And there's the blinds in one, there's the blinds in another. That's fully down but shut, that's fully down but slightly open. There's the blind in that one, and that's the blind. That was not done on purpose. I was just there and I thought, yeah, and I'm expecting to predict how that's going to work in practice. How many times are blinds down and they never go up again? How do we actually do it? We say, well, they're going to get them down with outside daylight availability. Do they? Might be nice to think they could. How's the percentage of glazing and carbon benefits? You can do loads of charts like this. You can put in decent glass. But these are just a few of the things. Wind speed and U value. As the wind speed goes up, usually the number of the, that's just changing one variable. The U value goes up from there from 1 up to 1.25, just on wind speed on that glass. Okay? Next one. All of the calculations are done with no temperature differential across it, so it's optimum performance. If you get hotter or you get colder, the performance drops off. So you might say it's got a U value based on ISO down there at 1.05, but in reality, if I'm using it, and if I'm using it in the Antarctic, it's probably 2. But in our normal range, we might go down to there. So when you want the performance, you haven't got it. And that's just another one variable, but you could use the 2 of them. What happens with the cavity widths? And it depends on what gas is in it or whether it's air. What actually happens, that's a limit of the hours at these temperatures through a normal year in London. So it's anything between -5 up to 30 in this case. That's the number of hours on this side, so it's usually around there. And the optimum one they always quote is here. And then when down here, I really want it not to get cold in my building. It gets cold because the windows are shot to pieces because no one took account the temperature difference across it. Does the U value in, because we've done it on the ISO standards which say you take the same temperature outside and inside. So the models are not that good, are they, really, if you look at it in that way? Do things get better with air tightness? Well, this is a nice one. Right, air tightness is 7, 5 is 3. The tighter you get, the better your energy reduction. What is really important there is not the U values of roofs, and not all the U values of cores. The big wins are lighting loads and the specific fan powers. Let's do another one. That one there, well, it went down with 3, not 5, because it was overheating most of the time in that mixed use one, and actually having it more airtight didn't give you the free cooling that you were getting. It's other levels, and balance point probably is around 4. So you could look at optimums, but when are you going to get that? You don't know what you're going to get. You just put in a number and it's done under an artificial test. Where should you put your glass? I really got to stop, haven't I? So just a couple of things here. U values. People calculate U values, and most software does not do it properly. And we've had 3 ways of doing it over time, and people do lovely charts of saying, back at this level of building regs, we needed 0.6, then it went to 0.45, and when it went to then 0.35. And what they don't get is actually, it says clearly in the beginning of the document, we've changed the U values, not just by the number, but by the way we calculate it. Now, how much difference was the calculation method making from looking at old methods to new methods? So this is the latest way of doing it. And we went from the way most people were taught at university. You put a line through it, and you work out what the resistance is of each one with the inside and outside. And you calculate, oh, it's good, it's got a U value of 0.26. Has it really? If you went to the 1995 method with proportional area method, the U value calculated for exactly the same one as proportional area method was 0.3. If you do it under Part L 2002, it's 0.32. Now, people say it passes easily, but if the pass mark is 0.3, it actually fails. But you've calculated it using that, so you say it passes. That's quite a big difference just because we've changed the way we calculate it. And again, most people are not aware of that. Are the numbers that go even behind those things any use to you? So what's a vapor resistivity? I only do condensation calcs. And you're relying upon data. And CIBSE is brilliant for this. It gives you minimum values and it gives you a typical one to use. And then it says this about a typical value. Typical values are taken from the middle of the range of values for each material and may be used for calculation in the absence of more specific data. However, it should be borne in mind that individual samples of materials may exceed these typical values by a factor of 2 or more. So we're doing all these calcs based on some number that we've taken out of the CIBSE guide. It says use 0.5, but they're telling you it could be 1 or 2. So what do you do? Should you do it with the minimum and the max and say, oh, under this one it fails and under that one it passes? That's not a lot use to anyone, is it? So we take typical values that we know are not right, and then when we measure our buildings, we say, oh, well, we haven't got what you said we'd do. Well, you didn't even know what the materials were. These ones are lovely. This is a scatter graph. Now, this is embodied carbon, but it's not a lot different. what's the embodied carbon and materials? Well, here is the data that goes behind giving you what it's going to be for aluminium. Now, some clever geezers managed to get it into these really low amounts of energy, and other people up here are wasting a load. And this is actually in energy. It's not in carbon and be messed around in that way. So if you look at it, for aluminium, there's 111 records, and it varies anything between 8 and 382. Or it could be between 55 and 100. They're all quite a long way apart. So what should I do? Well, it says, well, hold on, we'll take 104.7, because that's the standard we'll use. But be aware, it could be 8, or it could be 382. Why am I bothering doing a calculation? If I take the worst case, it'll always fail. And that happens with condensation if you do that. If you take the worst cases, you won't get a surface that works. So we take the typical ones, because CIBSE say to take the typical value. But we know that it won't work like that. And then it's even worse when you get on site and you say, well, these are the calculated, but the actual measured with full workmanship are 5 times worse. And the other big con is floors. Now, how many of you give a different floor U value for every single room you do? Every single room should have a different U value for the floor, depending on how close it is to the outside. And inside might even have a heat gain coming through it and not a loss. But people say, if we did all the proper U values in the perimeter, it would fail the Part L test, because they got below this number. And at the edge, it could be 1 or 1.2. And then we put up a building, and it's cold in the perimeter. Why? Because we've used a U value that applies across the whole floor, and actually, that loss is all in the perimeter. And it happens to be also where we've got often cold downdraft, and we've got a cold surface, and we're feeling freezing cold, yet we've designed it right, because we've taken the mean temperature in the middle of the room, the mean U value, and then we expect the building to perform properly. So I shall stop with that, because essentially we say it's fully mixed, and here we quite clearly say it's 18 down there, it's 26 up there, so we've got heat gain and loss through different things, and we ignore them in our calcs. This is one we did. Oh, I will say just a little bit of this because I was involved with doing it. I wanted to rename that as a better guess at internal gains. It's called evaluating operational energy performance of a building at the design stage. Well, it's not really, because it's saying if you know what it is, you can put it in. Well, you don't know what it is until it's designed. But it does help you, and it does get closer to it when you fine-tune it. And it tells you you've got to take in things like catering. And catering's a massive thing. You need to take into account the lifts. And you can easily have a lift in a lobby using 58 kilowatt hours to make it work. So you can have massive gains. And what you're saying with this, which I like, is this, that each of them has a high and a medium and a low. So for heating, it could be in that range, and this could be in that range, and it could be in this range. And all you're telling people is, no, we can't calculate it right, so we'll give you some boundaries, and it's anything between 20 and 200. And people don't like that, because they say, can you be a bit more accurate? Well, can we? I don't know. Yet we'd love to give them a number, and we've got to follow the standard ways of doing it, which stops you doing it, you might say, in more detail. And then we've got to make sure it's giving results at the end. And when you go back in and test them, you'll find all sorts of things that happen, the issue, the cause, and a solution for it. So it does need to be commissioned properly. We do need to make sure it's not just set up on day one, but it needs to be seasonally commissioned. So there's loads of commissioning guides out there. Soft landing I'm a great fan of, but everyone says it's soft landing, and all they mean it was a bit more handover management, or we've taken on a bit at the end to look how it performs. Soft landing starts at stage 0, and then 1, and then 2. And if you don't start in commissioning design to start with, it's not like your work at the end. It's good to see that the new BREEAM is going to tackle the performance gap, because it says we model it. Now, does modelling actually gut the performance gap? I've got my doubts. But if you want to get into this sort of stuff with digital engineering, we've got a new society for it, and I've gone on too long, and sorry, I'll shut up. Questions?
Very much, Anne. I think because we've gone on,
Yeah,
we won't ask questions now, but are you going to stick around for a little bit? If anyone does want to stick around and
give me a hard time.
Questions, yeah, then feel free to do that now.
I can
make everyone stay. But yeah, again, thank you very much. You can always